So for those that have been following this channel for a while, you know I do a lot of stuff about 3D printers. However, if you pay a lot of attention, I don't really do a lot besides build 3D printers, review 3D printers, mod 3D printers, and a lot of Voron stuff as well. But I don't really do any big projects with my 3D printers. That's about to change. So let's start off with a little bit of history. When I got involved with 3D printing almost about 5 years now, one of the first things I wanted to do was print an Iron Man helmet. Now, at the time, my very first 3D printer was a Monoprice Select Mini. It's not really a big printer. However, I did find some files that would allow me to print an Iron Man mask in multiple different parts. And after printing a few parts, I realized, you know what, I'd rather do it in one piece. So I started looking for a bigger printer. At first I decided about modding the Monoprice. I quickly dropped that idea. I ended up building a Voron, and that led me down a different path. I ended up getting involved with Voron design, building a lot of Vorons, ended up starting a YouTube channel, and almost 5 years later, here we are now, and I still don't have that Iron Man helmet. But I have a lot of printers, and you know what? It's about time we undertook a big project involving these 3D printers. So what we're going to be building is a semi-custom set of heavy infantry Mandalorian armor. For those that have watched the show The Mandalorian, you may be familiar with the character of, and I hope I pronounce this right, Paz Vizsla. You can purchase a set of armor that resembles his armor from, I used Galactic Armory, and I've printed that whole set. We're going to be building a whole suit of Mandalorian armor from that. Now, I'm putting my own spin on it. This is not going to be a screen accurate suit of armor or cosplay. I'm doing this just for fun. So I'm doing my own colors, my own finishing. I've swapped out some parts already from different sets. I'll touch on that later, further episodes in the series. But I'm using this kind of as a learning experience. Now, there's a lot that goes into building one of these sets of armor, as I've recently found out, including a lot of soft parts, clothes, tunics, vests. It's not all printed parts wearing over a jumpsuit. There's quite a bit involved. So in today's video, we're gonna be talking about the printed parts, what I printed them in, why I printed them that way, and how I'm going about finishing them, because I found a method that actually works pretty good, gives great results, and it actually doesn't require a ton of work, which when you have almost 10 kilograms of printed parts, saving a little bit of time here and there saves a lot of time. So let's get started. So first things first, printing all the parts. This actually only took me about a week. And that was because I had about 5 printers running non-stop. I came back from the Midwest Rep Fest with a gift called COVID. I was locked in the basement. I had several kilos of ABS, a bunch of printers, and nothing else to do. So I had them running 24/7. So with all my printers running, I knocked off pretty much the whole set of armor in a week. However, I did spend about another week reprinting some parts here and there, and I'll go on to my first point. If you're printing a full set of armor such as this, anytime you have left and right parts or duplicate parts, print one off first, check sizing. On most humans, your left arm and your right arm are about the same. If you're right-handed, your right arm might be a little bit bigger. Same if you're left-handed, your left arm might be a little bit bigger, but for the most part, you're the same. So if you're gonna print gauntlets, print one, check the fit, and then print the other one. Several parts, such as the gauntlets, and especially like my thigh pieces, I actually ended up completely reprinting at a different scale because I didn't like the fit. So make sure you test size, do some test prints, make sure you're printing everything at the correct scale for your body type. These prints, I guess, were scaled for a human who is 6 feet tall. I am 5'9½", so I did have to adjust the sizing of some parts, not everything though. For example, the helmet, printed correctly at its right scale, fits on my noggin well enough. Now, when it comes to material I printed all these plastic parts out of, for the exception of a few parts that were printed on the resin machine, simply because they were small, high detailed parts, I printed everything in either ABS or ASA for multiple reasons. One, I have machines that are capable of printing those materials beautifully. All the parts were printed on 3 of my Vorons, as well as a Bamboo X1 carbon and an FL Sun V400 that is enclosed. They all print ABS beautifully. So if you can print ABS, it has a lot of advantages. The first one is, if you have to attach multiple parts together, With ABS and ASA, you can acetone weld them. So using acetone, a brush, wearing proper PPE, gloves, eye pro, a mask, and a well-ventilated environment, you just put a little acetone on each side of the mating surface, hold them together for a couple seconds, couple minutes. They'll fuse together, they'll weld together, and that joint will be stronger than the plastic itself for the most part. So it's a really easy way to attach multiple parts together into one bigger part if you can't print it as one. 2, ABS/ASA, you can sand it very easily. Many of these parts, I just hand sanded with some 220 grit sandpaper, and I didn't really have to go in and fill any layer lines. There were a few spots, depending on how the object printed, that still needed some Mando filler putty to fill the layer lines before going into sanding. But on vertical surfaces or near vertical surfaces, sandpaper alone was pretty much enough to smooth it out to get it ready for the next step. Also, it's summer. There are heat waves, global warming, it's a thing. I've been working in my garage. My garage is hot. I will be transporting these parts places in my car. I don't want my suit of armor that I spend months working on melting in a hot car on a sunny day. So with everything being in ABS, you can leave it in your car on a hot day. You don't need to worry about deforming or melting. So it sands easily, it's not gonna melt on you, and you can acetone weld it together. Now, when it comes to finishing up the parts, and I'll be doing videos on all the different steps that I'm doing for this whole armor set, I decided early on that I kind of wanted to do my own spin on the look of the armor. I didn't want to go with a flat, matte surface. If you look a lot at printed parts that are used for Mandalorian armor, a lot of sanding's involved, Bondo, basically sanding it, getting it to that surface, that mirrored finish, using chrome paints or other paint depending on what color you want. And you have to hide all the layer lines. There's a lot of elbow grease involved in hiding all the layer lines, and you can do that if you want that look, but I kind of wanted a textured look. I've been going for a more cast look. I want it to kind of resemble, like for those that have ever worked in a tool shop, the kind of finish you see on like Lay's or Bridgeport, like that machine look. And I actually found a really good sheet using this stuff. This is just Stone Shield. It's a rock guard. I had this from fixing my Focus in the garage, and I just kind of tried it on a test piece, and it worked quite well. So I also did try bed liner. That was suggested in a few videos I watched. Bed liner does work, however, I only tried it on a few parts. I decided I didn't like it. I prefer this stuff. I prefer the texture that this gives, and 2, this is a little bit thinner than bed liner. Bed liner I found was a little too thick, and it had a tendency to kind of turn sharp corners into rounded corners. This stuck better to corners, and it didn't really build up too thick, and I like the texture more. So it's just Stone Shield Stone Guard. I'm sure you can find it from multiple different brands. So the process for finishing these parts was quite simple. After the part was printed, if there were any details that I did have to go over with Bondo or spot putty, I would do that right away. So for example, on the toe gaps here, they were printed vertically such as this. So along the top here, the layer lines were quite pronounced. So I did fill that up with some Bondo spot and glaze putty. Let that dry, and then I sanded the whole thing. I used some 220 grit sandpaper, sanded everything nice and smooth, wiped off any residue after, any grit, and then I hit it with some primer and filler spray. So give it a light coat of that, let it dry, repeat that a few times. Afterwards, I did go back in on a few parts and try wet sanding to see if that would improve. I ended up stopping wet sanding after a few tries just because I found it wasn't really needed. But I did go back in one more time with a higher grit sandpaper to give everything one last final smooth, make sure there was no high points, low points, make sure it looked good. After you're happy with the surface finish, and you can repeat the Bondo sanding process again and again until you're happy with it. Make sure everything's clean, and then I do hit it with one coat of the Stone Shield here. Now, this stuff does go on thick, but it does dry thin. So Went ahead, sprayed a coat on every visible surface of the printed part that will be part of the armor. Let it dry thoroughly at this point. After it's dry, I went and painted them. Now, with my armor here, I did decide that I would be going with a red and silver based color scheme. For the silver, it's just some generic silver spray paint I bought at Lowe's. I can't remember exactly what brand. For the red, this is actually car paint that I bought at the local crappy tire. I believe it's GM Autumn Maple. So after the stone shield is dried, went ahead, sprayed it in whatever color I was using as the main color for that part. 2 coats of that later, letting it dry in between. I was ready to move on to the finishing step. Now, depending on the part, some parts I wanted to use both colors. So in that case, I would use some masking tape, mask off the areas, spray them with the other color that I was going to be using. If you are masking stuff off, make sure you let the paint dry thoroughly before masking it up. If you mask up paint that's still wet, when you remove the masking tape, you can peel off the paint. Now, after the rattle can spray, I moved on to finalizing and weathering the parts. Now, at this point, I don't have an airbrush kit. I do plan on getting one at some point to do some more detail work on some of this. But at this point, with what I have on hand, I kind of fell back to what I picked up when I used to play Warhammer. Oh God, it's been like 15 years ago. And that is dry brushing. So using some silver paint and a dry brush, I went along and I hit some of the highlight areas of the parts. For example, on these hand guards, around the knuckle areas, basically anywhere on the part where I feel if this was armor and it was metal and it was painted, where would you knock it and bump it and scuff it, and where would you chip the paint off? So went ahead, hit the highlights, did some dry brushing to kind of make it look a little worn, and then I washed it, and I washed it with some acrylic, black acrylic paint mixed with water. And what this process does, it basically dirties up the part. There's different ways of going about this. The method I used was simply mix some black acrylic paint and some water, use an old brush, slather it over the whole part. I let it dry for a couple seconds, just basically let it set, and then I go in with a paper towel and I dab up the excess. And basically this fills up all the little nooks and crannies and low spots with some dark paint, and it basically just makes it look dirty, gives it a little bit of a weathered effect, doesn't make it look as shiny and new. If you have an airbrush, you can of course also use some like black acrylic or dark brown acrylic and an airbrush kit and do the same thing in all the corners. There's all kinds of different ways to weather parts. I'm just using what I have on hand right now, and I'm also learning along the way. So if you have any tips or suggestions at any point during this video series, comments below. I'm all ears. I'm learning as well as you are. So all in all, this process that I'm using works quite well, and it's quite efficient. Some of the parts, such as this shoulder pauldron here, still take a little bit of time. But for example, this elbow guard here, I believe it goes like that. Yeah, well, I think it goes like that. This took maybe 10-15 minutes to finalize. There were some parts along this side that I had to do the Bondo just to fill in because it was printed with support. Make it nice and smooth, let that dry. Sand the whole thing. It's mostly flat surfaces that were printed vertically, so sanding really didn't take a lot of time. Clean it up, quick coat of primer filler, another coat of sand, and then clean it. Hit it with the stone shield, let that dry. Hit it with paint, let that dry. A little bit of dry brushing on anywhere that I would like to scuff up. A wash, let it dry, and it's done. Ready to put some Velcro on it, slap it on the armor once I get the undersuit built. So yeah, that is the current process I'm using for the printed parts. I still have a lot of printed parts to go, a lot more that have more work involved on getting them ready. For example, the helmet here, as you can see, we are not at the process yet. This one, I'm spending a lot of time getting it really nice and smooth and rounded, as well as the blaster here. This is gonna take a lot of detail work. So I'm still in the process of getting this all done. This was printed in multiple parts. This is the first video in this series. Again, there's still a lot to cover for building this armor. I will do more videos along the way. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see more like this, make sure you mention that in the comments below. And if you have any more tips, comments below. Again, I'm learning as I'm going here, so any good tips would be appreciated. I hope you enjoyed the video today. I hope you learned something new. If you want to help support the channel, content I create, things I do, links in the description as well. Thank you, and have a great day.